Today's lesson is about the diversity of life and a little bit of background for looking at the different kingdoms and domains. So when we look at diversity, we have to look at all the species that exist on the planet. And there are so many that we really need to start looking at grouping them so we can look at relationships or how to predict when we look at something new. So biologists came up with a way to group things, and so the unit of groups, those little groups that we have, the short form of that is called taxons. And so when we start talking about taxonomy, we're talking about how to group life. And we can say the father of the classification was Carolus Linnaeus, and I'm going to hopefully spell his name correctly because I always seem to misspell it. A-E-U-S. Okay, and in 1758, he came up with the binomial nomenclature. And since then, biologists all around the world have adapted this and continue to use it, especially when looking after the names. So everyone has the same name across the world, and it's sort of rooted in Latin, and it's just the genus and the species name. And you have to remember when you're writing these down, you always underline them if you're handwriting, or if you are typing or putting it into a word processor, please always put the genus and species in italics, and you capitalize the genus, and you keep the species in lowercase. Okay, and if you go further up, species is the ultimate one. We can tell what a species is. We've defined species before. But everything above that, so when you're looking ahead, like genus or family or order and things like that, it's more arbitrary. They've put them into groups according to what their needs were. And so when you look, we have the classification system as of today where we have a domain, which is the most general, and then under that is kingdom. And then we go to phylum, class, order, family, and then finally genus, then species. Okay, and as I like to sort of remember, that is King Phil, comes over for good supper. The original classifications were not based on genetic relationships or lineages. They actually turned out to be quite linked, but now with today's branching and things like that, we do use a monophyletic branch or a clade. So if you were talking about phylogenetic trees or cladograms, we use those to help sort and look at the different breaks for families and groups. So when we're looking at types of cells, we've already talked about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So when we start looking at diversity, we have to start looking at that. But we also branch life according to how things live. So when you start looking at how things live, you have to think about, well, what sort of means of metabolism do they have? Okay, so when we're looking at metabolism, or how they're obtaining their energy and how they're using that, there are three branches of metabolism that we look at, and it's basically how they use the gases and things in their area, for lack of a better word. And we have obligate, anaerobes, facultative anaerobes, and then we have obligate aerobes. Okay, so when we're looking at that, a way to remember that is obligate or obligatory anaerobe means oxygen is a poison to them. Okay, they can't live in oxygen. They're no oxygen wannabes. Okay, anaerobic means lacking oxygen. Obligate means they have to live with no oxygen. Okay, these are organisms that will die in the presence of oxygen. Facultative anaerobes say they can live with no oxygen, or they can live just happily with oxygen. Okay, and then obligate anaerobes must have oxygen to survive. And not just oxygen, but must have adequate levels of oxygen to survive. So when you look at us, we're obligate aerobes. Yeast and some fungi are facultative anaerobes, as are some bacteria, and some bacteria are obligate anaerobes. So hopefully that sort of makes some sense. And so when we're talking later on about some different species, and I start using these terms, hopefully that makes sense. The other little bit we want to talk about is how they obtain nutrients. How do they basically feed themselves? Okay. Nutrient obtainment. And when we're looking at nutrient obtainment, there are 4 types here. There are photoautotrophs, and you may have discussed autotrophic in past classes. There are photoheterotrophs, we have chemoautotrophs, and we have chemoheterotrophs. So if you were discussing in previous ecological situation where we talk about heterotrophs and autotrophs, heterotrophs usually mean you need to obtain things from other sources, whereas autotrophs is, well, when they're able to produce their own carbon-based food, essentially, like sugars. So a photoautotroph basically is a photosynthetic being. The concept of photosynthetics is nice, but you have to remember, if it's a eukaryotic photosynthetic, they usually are producing oxygen. Bacteria that are photoautotrophs, they are also photosynthetic, but quite often they'll use hydrogen sulfide instead of water, and instead of releasing oxygen as a byproduct, they may release sulfur as a byproduct. Photoheterotrophs, they need light as an energy source, but they also require organic carbon from other sources. And hence the heterotroph part. Okay? Chemoautotrophs, they're quite wild because they use inorganic molecules to fix carbon dioxide. They don't use they don't use light, they use inorganic molecules to do that, to produce their carbon molecules. And the other one, the chemoheterotrophs, that's basically us. They need to obtain their carbon, their organic carbon, from other sources. So think about us. We have to eat for our energy because we have to obtain our organic carbon from another source. Chemoautotrophs, they don't. They can fix carbon dioxide without the help of light. They can use a chemical to do that. Photoheterotrophs are similar to us in a way, but they also need to use light energy as a form of energy. And photoautotrophs, those are typically photosynthetic organisms. Hopefully this makes sense because we're moving on to our next lesson when we're going to start looking at the different domains and kingdoms of the diverse nature that is life. Thank you for joining in.